Good afternoon. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I am the Executive Director of the Congregational Library and Archives. Welcome to Acquisitions Afternoon, a virtual program focused on collecting Congregationalism and the Founding 56 Adopt-a-Book program. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the Congregational Library and Archive resides in what is now known as Boston, which is in the place of the Blue Hills, the homeland of the Massachusetts people, whose relationships and connections with the land continue to this day and into the future. For those of you joining us for the first time, the Congregational Library and Archives is an independent research library. Established in 1853, CLA's mission is to foster a deeper understanding of the spiritual, intellectual, cultural, and civic dimensions of the congregational story and its ongoing relevance in the 21st century. We do this through free access to our research library of 225,000 books, pamphlets, manuscripts, and periodicals, and our digital archive, which has more than 110,000 images, many drawn from our New England's Hidden Histories project. Throughout the year, we offer educational programs and research fellowships for students, scholars, churches, and anyone interested in Congregationalism's influence on the American story. Please check our website, congregationallibrary.org, to learn more about what we do and for news of forthcoming events. The inspiration for today's program comes from our most recent online exhibition, Founding 56, the Congregational Library's original collection. In 1853, a donation of 56 print and manuscript works from 8 donors became the foundational collection of the newly established Congregational Library. Though the collection now numbers over 225,000, the themes found within those volumes have had a significant impact on the library's development. 170 years later, we are still actively collecting materials at the Congregational Library. Last year, for example, we acquired over 300 print publications for the collection, ranging from the 16th through the 21st centuries. Some came in through the generosity of donors, while others were purchased with the limited acquisition funds we have here at the library. On the archive side, 190 cubic feet of material came into the collections, almost entirely by donation. In this material, there are additions to 7 collections that were already here at the library, and then 11 completely new collections. And we're working to make those collections available to you. Without an active acquisitions program, we'd be unable to tell the 400+ year story of Congregationalism in all of its complexity and diversity. From the Dutch books likely read by the Pilgrims to a 2023 board game on how to grow your church. So yeah, you heard that right. You can come to the Congregational Library to play a board game. A word about the format for today's event. Soon I will welcome Heather Kurtz, the Congregational Library's Director of Development, to introduce you to this year's Adopt-a-Book program. She's going to talk more about what Adopt-a-Book is and how you can be involved. She will then introduce our featured speaker and avid book collector, Reverend Dr. Davida Foy Crabtree. Following Davida's talk, we will have questions. We have time for questions with you, our virtual audience. So I'm going to go ahead and invite my colleague, Heather, to turn herself on and to introduce you to Adopt-a-Book. Hey, Heather.
Thank you, Kyle. Complementing our Founding 56 digital exhibition, we are delighted to launch our first Adopt-a-Book program. By adopting a text, you support the library's core activities to conserve, acquire, digitize, and archive materials that help us preserve and interpret the congregational story. Adoption is easy. Choose from one of 10 staff-recommended selections up for adoption. Once you complete the selection form, I personally will follow up with you to discuss how you would like your name, or that of a loved one or honoree, to appear on a bookplate within the document and also within our collection catalog. Several items are up for adoption that were donated to create the library in 1853, including Anthony Benezet's 1762, A Short Account of Africa and the Slave Trade, and Thomas Weld's Commonplace book from 1723. Now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Reverend Dr. Davida Foy Crabtree. Davida has served for over 50 years in the ministries of the United Church of Christ. Raised in a tiny rural church in Northwest Connecticut, she went to Andover Newton and on to parish and non-parish ministries, including 23 years in conference ministry. Her family taught her to learn from the past. So in her early years, when she encountered those who thought women should not be ordained, she began to collect the works of Reverend Antoinette Brown Blackwell and other women of the suffrage era. That collection and her own archives are now held by the Congregational Library and Archives. Davida, welcome.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you, Kyle. It's a delight to be here to tell a little bit of story of my evolution as a collector. My mother plays an important role in this because when I was about 6 or 7, she began at every birthday and Christmas to give me a book about a girl who had grown up to be an important woman. Women like Belva Lockwood, the girl who ran for president, Susan B. Anthony, Molly Pitcher, and so many others. She planted seeds in me that I didn't even know were there until many years later. But I grew up in a little tiny rural village and was part of a tiny church. In that village, there was an auctioneer, and there were frequent auctions that we would go to. It was our form of entertainment in those days. I'm showing my age. I must have been about 12 at this particular auction under a tree out in the dirt parking lot behind our church. And we're a partway through the auction, and the auctioneer holds up a book, and he just looks at the spine and reads off the title, and he says, "It's by Mrs. Stowe." And I looked at my mother and I said, "I want that book." There was a family legend that we were somehow related to the Beechers. I just really had to have that book. And so no one else apparently figured out that it was Harriet Beecher Stowe and it was a first edition. But I bid at 12 years old and paid $1 for that book. And I was thrilled, and there began my addiction. Decades later, when I was at Andover Newton, there really were not resources in the library that addressed women's perspective on biblical narrative or history or anything really, except some very traditionalist books. And that led me on vacations and weekends to all the old book barns that were then spread across northern New England in particular. No one else wanted these books. Some of them are arrayed on the shelf behind me, and I picked them up for 50 cents, 75 cents. Nobody wanted them. They were later worth quite a bit. Then after a time, I began to collect in earnest and focused on Antoinette Brown and Antoinette Brown Blackwell, her married name. She was, after all, the first woman ordained in the United States, perhaps in the world, and she was ordained in 1853, the year of the founding of the Congregational Library. She was a Renaissance woman, an incisive social critic. I would like to give you an example of her writing from something that very few people have ever read. I actually got this book in 1996, the year I became conference minister in Connecticut, from Russell Friedman at Second Life Books in Lanesboro, Massachusetts, who was my co-collaborator in feeding my addiction. But let me read to you from Antoinette. It's excerpted from a 3-page essay. It's entitled "The Size of Souls." A quaint old writer describes a class of persons who have souls so very small that 500 of them could dance at once upon the point of a cambric needle. These wee people are often wrapped up in a lump of the very coarsest of human clay, ponderous enough to give them the semblance of full-grown men and women. A grain of mustard seed buried in the heart of a mammoth pumpkin would be no comparison to this little soul sheathed in its full-grown body. The contrast in size would be insufficient to convey an adequate impression, and the tiny soul has little of the mustard seed spiciness. Yet if this mass of flesh is only wrapped up in a white skin, even though it is not nearly thick enough to conceal the grossness and coarseness of the veiled material, the poor, feeble folk soul within will fancy that he really belongs to the natural variety of aristocratic humanity. He has the good taste to refuse condescension sufficient to allow him to eat at table with a Frederick Douglass, a Samuel R. Ward, or a Dr. Pennington. Poor light little soul. It can borrow a pair of flea's legs and, hopping up to the magnificent lights of public opinion, sit looking down upon the whole colored race in sovereign contempt. Take off the thin veneering of a white skin, substitute in its stead the real African ebony, and then place him side by side of one of the above-mentioned men. Measure intellect with intellect, eloquence with eloquence. Mental and moral infancy stand abashed in the presence of nature's noblemen. So mere complexion is elevated above character. May heaven alleviate our undiluted stupidity. You go, Antoinette. Seems almost contemporary to me. An amazing woman in her writing. After a time, I developed a bibliography of wants, and we might put an example of that up, Kyle. This was a bibliography of all 44 of her works that I developed over time, and these were dropped at every book dealer and at every antiquarian book festival that I haunted all the time. It was instrumental in a number of acquisitions over a period of time, but I owe much of my ability to acquire these works to Russell Friedman at Second Life Books. I sometimes was convinced that I could tell from the outside of a bookstore that there was an Antoinette Brown book within. And you will laugh, but I remember pulling up in my car in front of an old bookstore in Northwoods, New Hampshire, and absolutely had this sense come over me that there was an Antoinette inside and I just needed to find it. And I looked through all the traditional categories of the old and rare books that they had, and I didn't find it, but I kept looking, and all of a sudden I came upon this book, Sea Drift by Blackwell. I almost could have missed it, but it's a book of her poetry, and yes, that will come to the Congregational Library once I finish reading it. Then there was the day in the early 2000s when I had an appointment to see my old high school librarian, a woman I particularly cherished. Turned out she had been hired to liquidate the books of our former school nurse's estate. There were thousands. The family had accumulated books, and I don't think they ever let one go. I talked to Ruth by phone ahead of time, and she had a large pile of books for me to look at. Some great women's history and literature, and I set most of them aside to buy, and working my way down the pile. All the way at the bottom were two small volumes. Their spines were chipped. Their pages were foxed. They were old and dusty. And I knew I had to have them no matter what price she was asking. The 2-volume set of memoirs of Margaret Fuller of Soley. I was in heaven. This woman was an early journalist, the first American woman war correspondent, and a strong women's rights advocate. She was the first woman allowed to use the library at Harvard and influenced the suffragists hugely. Tenderly, I opened the cover of the first volume. Here is what I saw. These two books are what Antoinette Brown was reading in South Butler, where she was the pastor of the Congregational Church in the year of her ordination. Let that sink in, and can you imagine my reaction? Even better in some ways than a book she had written. to know that this was what she was reading in the time of her ordination. A collector's dream. These too will come your way, Kyle. Through all the years, I also collected works related to African American history, particularly anti-slavery volumes, and those have now been sold, but I loved learning the history from those contemporaneous works. One day in the early 80s, my husband and I were on a day off, and we were exploring spots of interest not far from Colchester, Connecticut, where I was serving as pastor. We crossed the Connecticut River in East Haddam, and right across the river, I spotted a sign, weathered, old, chipping sign that said old books and pointed to a barn. Barns had been fruitful for me, so we stopped. I think David probably rolled his eyes, not again. And I pawed through a motley mess. This barn had not been well kept, and the contents were in terrible condition. But I found this, an 1852 paper edition of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Wasn't worth the 50 cents I paid for it until years later, when the Stowe Center in Hartford was having annual readings of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And I showed up with this copy and read the portion assigned to me from its tiny print in this battered book. Everyone in the room was completely transfixed with this, not at all a collector's item, but definitely one for me. So as I aged, I began to wonder, what am I going to do with all these books? At one point, I had close to 4,000. Who should be their stewards? That is the prime question as we come toward the end of life, of course. Who will carry on? My conclusion was obvious. The Congregational Library deserved to receive all my Antoinette-related material, old and rare books and other ephemera. Its long history of cherished cultivation of its collection, its deep reputation for excellence of stewardship, its devotion to the true and deep history of our tradition, with all its warts and wrinkles, appealed to me. So on a fall day in the late 2000s, Peggy Bendroth drove to Connecticut, and I turned over most of my Antoinette Brown Blackwell collection. As she left, I wept, genuine tears of grief at no longer owning those precious books, but also tears of relief, knowing that they would be so well cared for and available to scholars of all stripes for decades to come. And then when I needed to sell my home and downsize, I hesitantly inquired whether there was any chance the Congregational Library would ever want, such as I had assembled over all my years, documents that describe my growing up in that rural village, my emergence into very hesitating leadership as a teenager, and my call into ministry and service as a pastor and a conference minister. I had kept all sorts of materials from all those years. As a collector of books, I was also a collector of my own archives. I was surprised when the answer was yes. I really thought archives were only for really outstanding leaders and people who'd held very important roles. But I gather that the story of a girl who loved books and history, who persisted in the face of constant resistance, and who loved the church, made some people think there would be worth in those papers. So if you're thinking of donating your archives or your books, please know that this staff is incredibly helpful. I don't drive to Boston anymore, and they have made it possible for me to have alternative access to all of it. And it's lovely knowing that as I fade from this mortal coil, parts of me will live on as a heritage for the future. I am so grateful for the Congregational Library. Thank you.
And do know how grateful we are to you, Davida, for entrusting us with these fantastic collections. I think when I was interviewing for the position here, and I asked what are some of the standout collections we have, it was your Antoinette Brown Blackwell collection that Sarah Trotta, our librarian, said, "Oh, you have to see this. You have to know about this." So, and I think there's that way that this is an institution that has grown through the generosity of careful collectors who put together, really exemplary collections of materials that then they care enough about letting other people use. So these are wonderful pieces that you shared. It's so wonderful too that you still have pieces with you. I think one of the things that donors sometimes fear is that they have to hand over everything all at once. And really, I think what we aim to do, and I hope we've done here, is build a relationship, so that when you feel comfortable, giving us a sea drift when you're done reading it, that we can then, and I look forward to having the chance to drive down to Connecticut instead of Peggy to pick it up. So since we're talking about, and I want to let everybody know in the audience, if you have a question, go ahead and use the Q&A function. Some are already starting to come in, and we've got some time for conversation here. Where should we begin with the 40 plus writings of Antoinette Brown Blackwell if we've never read anything before? Is there one place that you think is a really great start for diving in?
Other than that amazing little essay on the size of souls.
Yes.
Well, let me think. Probably I would start with the Kasdan biography of her, because that then can lead you to understand her context.
Mm-hmm.
And her writings, I need to pull my bibliography here. I never was able to find the book, The Social Side of Mind and Action, and that's the one I would really have loved to have read. But I think The Philosophy of Individuality, or The One and the Many, was really intriguing, and a kind of cross between sociology, anthropology, philosophy. As I said, she's such a Renaissance woman that would be, and that is in your collection. That is in your collection. The book most people know of is called The Sexes Throughout Nature, and she was very influenced by the scientists of the day and read a great deal of science, and so her works are full ranging.
That's fantastic. So you referenced the social side of mind and action as one that you never quite grasped. Are there other books? Is that part of being a collector, that there's works that are always on your wish list, but that never quite?
There are several of her books I never found. The Physical Basis of Immortality, A Market Woman, which was fiction, and so forth. So there's always more. I yearned at one point in my life for a copy of the 2-volume Elizabeth Cady Stanton, The Woman's Bible, and did finally find that, thanks to Avery Post, our former general minister, our former president, who spotted it in an old and rare catalog and sent it on to me. So one is always looking. I have to restrain myself now.
I think it's fascinating today to think about the book barns still exist, although sadly I think there are fewer of them than there used to be. But the way in which eBay and online booksellers, and what advice would you have for the young collector, or the person who doesn't even know that they want to be a collector? How would they start? Because you kind of don't go from 0 to 4,000 books overnight.
Yeah. Well, I would not know how to do it using eBay or Abe Books or Alibrius or any of those, because for me, it's the feel of the book. It's that moment of opening and going, oh my God. So I think the best is to still find that that bookstore that has old and rare books in it, and go in there and just pull them off the shelf and read them tenderly and see which ones appeal to you, which ones have content that match up with your passions for your life, and go for it. They're going to disappear. They're all going to disappear, which is why I was so committed to getting as much of Antoinette's work as I could.
That's fantastic. We have an anonymous attendee says, thank you for your heartfelt presentation and for sharing your story with us today. I am fascinated. I look forward one day to reading your donated collection of Antoinette Brown Blackwell. Come on down. Congregational Library is open Monday through Friday from 9 to 4 p.m. We'd love to have you. I enjoyed hearing about the various ways you found these outstanding materials buried deep in barns. You are inspirational. Again, thank you for sharing this story with us. So a wonderful tribute there.
Cool.
And then we got Sheila Harvey writes, hello, Reverend
Hey,
Dr.
Sheila.
You have made a remarkable contribution in my life. What a sweet thing. How has reading Brown Blackwell's books help contribute to your ministry? How might her books speak to us today?
Well, you heard what she had to say in Autographs for Freedom. That essay, probably more than anything else, has had a big impact on me, and so support my anti-racism work. There are other pieces of Antoinette's that are in collections. She often presented papers at the Women's Congress of the Association for the Advancement of Women, and some of those papers are in the collection. And those spoke much more directly to women's issues and the empowerment of women, or the disempowerment of women. She also often spoke at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the National Women's Rights Conventions, etc. It's a long list. Only 9 of these are books. The other ones are all articles, and those are actually, you can actually find some of those online, and they're well worth sort of browsing your way through. There was one that she delivered before the World's Congress of Religions in 1894 on woman and the pulpit, for instance. So there are all kinds of wonderful stories, but mostly I've been influenced by her resolve. Now, Antoinette only lasted, I think it was 1 year at the church in South Butler. I'm sort of astonished that she even got the call when I think back to how groundbreaking that was. She was a good friend of Lucy Stone's, and I think she was supported by so many other women. She left parish ministry. She devoted herself to raising her family. She married into the Blackwell family, and Elizabeth Blackwell was the first woman doctor. And I think that knowing her story and the struggles that she faced has simply increased my resolve. I just don't quit, and that's because of Antoinette and the women that my mother taught me about.
Wonderful answer. Charlie Hambrick Stowe writes, Antoinette was ordained as a congregational minister, but he doesn't believe she remained a Congregationalist very long, or for her entire career. In any case, can you comment on her kind of theological or spiritual development over time? Do you kind of see that in the books?
Yes, you can. She left when she left Paris ministry. She left. She ended up being kind of a stump speaker in the anti-slavery and suffrage worlds. Controversy followed her a lot. How she wrote, I've forgotten how many children she had, but she was writing, in a household full of kids. And I think that her writing, so she was ordained in 1853, and she wrote The Sexes Throughout Nature in 1865. her influence, the reading that she did in science very much influenced, I think, her theological journey. And I think she left Congregationalism behind partly because it was so painful for her. She ultimately became, I believe, a Universalist. And that was not an unusual journey in those days for suffragists who wanted to leave the hidebound constraints of traditional Congregationalism or Baptists or wherever. And so I think that her journey was very much influenced by her work in writing on science and anthropology and so forth.
Your answer dovetails with an earlier question we had received. And so in what you've spent your career as a congregational minister, in what ways have you found that doing this work of collecting and really kind of recovering women's history has either strengthened your faith in Congregationalism or challenged it at times?
It's mostly strengthened because the congregational polity made it possible for Antoinette to be ordained. And indeed, the traditional congregational polity that we have inherited in the United Church of Christ, which is a blend, of course, of presbyterial and congregational, when it was time for me to come before the ecclesiastical council in that little tiny church in Northfield, Connecticut, I stood up there before the Litchfield South Association, and I remember this one elderly gentleman from the church, I think in Bethlehem, was sitting about 2/3 of the way back in the pews on the center left, and he pulled himself up to rise up and to ask a question. And I thought, oh boy, here it comes. Not only is she a woman, but she's divorced, all that stuff. And he said, "Young lady, where do you stand on this women's liberation movement?" And I said, "I am in full support, and I believe the teachings of Jesus are in full support." And he bounced his cane on the floor and he said, "Good for you," which was not what I expected. And, it was because of I didn't have to go through a hierarchy. Had this person had to go through a hierarchy, and I say that as one who ended up being in quasi-hierarchy, I probably wouldn't have gotten through because I really took people on around their use and abuse of power. But because it was an ecclesiastical council that valued laity as much as clergy, they voted to ordain me. Might have been over a few dead bodies, but they did vote it.
Well, I think we can all agree the world is a better place for that.
Thank you.
Wise decision. Nancy McKinney asks, can you tell us a little bit more about your mother's influence on you as a reader and student of history?
Well, those books, as a matter of fact, I have in the other room the Molly Pitcher book that she gave me. It's the only one that remains. I gave a couple to granddaughters. Are planted seeds in me of, I was an only child. And my parents were about a decade older than most of my friends' parents. And so I had a different journey through my childhood than most. I think my mother was very intentional in planting these seeds of, I learned early that a woman's life journey was not always going to be easy. Read Belva Lockwood, the girl who ran for president, if you want to learn that early in life. Molly Pitcher, who stepped up during the wars, all of that really had a big influence. My mother was a teacher. She had refused to marry my father when he proposed to her at age 20, I think, or 21. He had come over from the island of Guernsey, and he was deeply in love with her, and she with him. But when she graduated normal school and he asked her to marry, he made it clear that no wife of his was going to work outside the home. And my mother told me decades later that she turned him down because she felt called by God to be a teacher. And she told him that she had to be a teacher. And they parted ways and married then in 1943. Not 1920, it was 1930 or so. So 13 years elapsed before they married, and then I was born exactly 9 months later. But that's the strong woman that my mother was.
Yeah.
Strong sense of call.
I loved what you were saying about the thought process you were sort of going through with what to do with your own collection, what to do with your own personal archives. And with the hindsight that you've been sort of afforded of building the relationship here, and I would want to share with the audience, you recently, a couple weeks ago, sent us another accrual to that collection. So another set of materials that you found that continue to add to that story. You've also been a fantastic ambassador introducing us to other people whose collections, personal archives. With that benefit of hindsight, if there's somebody in the audience who's sort of watching this and thinking about, geez, should I, am I worthy? What would I need to do? Any sort of thoughts on how to maybe both build up the courage, but also to kind of think about what parts of your archive, you thought were really noteworthy or
Yeah. The first thing I did in thinking about all this, I did it for myself, was I put everything in a chronological order. So it starts with about age 8 with an early writing that I did. And it contains, I made the decision early on that I was not going to sanitize this collection. That if somebody in some future time wanted to see how a homely, bumbling little girl in a rural village ended up being a conference minister of the United Church of Christ, that I wanted them to see the whole picture. And I came across something recently that I haven't sent you because it's really almost too embarrassing to send. It was something I wrote in the throes of the teenage years when I hated myself, and did not think I was worth anything, except when I was in State Pilgrim Fellowship and at Silver Lake Conference Center.
Yeah.
That will come to you eventually, but it probably will come when I die. But I don't want to sanitize it. What good is a sanitized record?
Right.
You need the picture of the whole person. I mean, that was what I got from those books that my mother gave me. I mean, the whole picture. And that's what matters. And I would say, the Congregational Library may not be the repository for everybody, but there might well be. It might be Congregational Library, or it might be your college archival collection or your town's historical society. I took 8 boxes full of stuff to the Litchfield Historical Society, knowing I would come back with 6 of them. I came back with none.
Oh, wow.
They wanted all of it. So be adventurous. Don't worry about rejection. We've all experienced rejection all our lives. So, what's one more?
Yep.
Take the risk, take the chance. You might have just the right piece that fits in a puzzle that the Congregational Library needs to be able to see the whole picture.
So incredibly true. And, I think for anybody out there who's thinking about their own collections, print or archival, send an email to any of us. My email is directly on the staff page. Send it to our librarian or our archivist. Reach out. And it is that, it's what you're saying, Davida, about that conversation about if we know that there's another archive that has that other piece of the puzzle where the pieces would be in conversation. I think one of the things that your contributions have really helped us want to make a commitment to is collecting women's voices from, well, all periods, but really focusing and making sure, I think one of the things that sometimes we run up against is people assume that because we were founded in 1853 and because we represent a tradition that goes back to the 16th century, that people are only interested in the old stuff. And the 20th century is such a pivotal moment in the history of Congregationalism.
Yeah, it really is. It really is. And I think it's, for me, it's so cool that you were founded in the same year that Antoinette was ordained, and that these books that I'm going to send to you were being read by her. How cool.
So Karen Gravino writes, not a question, just a thank you for all that you have done, especially your collection of Antoinette Brown Blackwell, and also as our Connecticut Conference Minister. All of the files from the Connecticut women of the UCC for many years before, including many of your writings, are in the files now in the Congregational Library and Archives.
Oh, well, look at that.
So Karen is forcing me to reveal one of our newest acquisitions. With Karen and Martha Lape were so instrumental in helping bring in. So the Southern New England Women's Connection, which dates back to 1928, those collections are now here. We're just finishing the processing on them. So the finding aid should be available in the next couple of weeks. And again, I think really speaking to that building that synergy, right? We want to be a place that if you want to understand the experience of women in Congregationalism in the 20th century, 18th, 19th, 20th, 21st century, one thing that's been really striking to me is as church collections come in, how many churches have preserved their women's auxiliary meeting minutes, right? And Peggy Bendroth's recent book, Good and Bad, is a fantastic history of women, of Congregational church women.
Yeah. So
to see the King's Daughters and the Women's, Guild and the Christian Endeavor Society, all of these groups. I think we need to do is we need to continue to make those accessible. And I think maybe the next finding aid we really should be creating is a guide to women's sources at the CLA.
Oh, that would be great. I am keenly aware that it's possible that some of the reason I haven't been able to find some of these books is that they were burned. Or that they were thrown away, that they were dismissed because of who wrote them. And, we're living in a time, I saw Carol Carlson's question. Hey, Carol. We are living in a time when those attitudes are resurging, and the role of an archives and a congregational library is so important because we've got people out there. I mean, I remember a book coming out that announced that my ordination was the cause of the decline of Protestantism in the United States. And I said, whoa, look at the power I have. Like, come on, give me a break. But those kinds of attitudes and the attitudes toward what's permitted to be written or to be read are just frightening. Frightening for the person, frightening for democracy. So it's really important.
Absolutely. And it has been very distressing to see that uptick that we have seen across the nation in this. And I can guarantee you the Congregational Library does not play by those rules, that we strive to document the entire congregational experience. And I do hope I'll have to follow up about that, the book you've just referenced, to make sure we have that as well, so that somebody comes in and doesn't just see one viewpoint, right? But sees the integral role that, and the contingency, right, that comes with, 3 steps forward and those who want to drag us further back.
Exactly. Thanks so much, Kyle.
Thank you. This has been a fantastic conversation. Thank you for your generosity and for joining us today.
But speaking of generosity, I just want to say that I've decided to amend my will so that I can include the Congregational Library in my will.
Oh, that is fantastic. Thank you so much. And if anybody else wants to learn how to do that as well, send me an email. I'll be glad to help you with that. And if you do have a collection, all of your own papers, or a book collection, or ephemera collection that you've created, please don't hesitate to reach out. We love hearing from you, and honestly, that's how our library grows, is through your generosity. So thanks, everyone. Have a great afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Congregational Library program.